What did you witness or overhear as a child that still haunts you today as an adult? Just a heads up before I begin that this might be triggering to some people because of the descriptions of abuse. I grew up super poor as a child, and my family was always moving around. I lived with my mother and my grandmother would sometimes watch the neighborhood children to make a little extra money. We briefly lived in a trailer park when I was around 7 years old. I remember that there was this little boy from the neighborhood. His name was Tommy. He was about 5 and very small for his age. His mom's name was Debbie. And I remember that she would always have this revolving door of boyfriends that she was always going out with, so she left her son with us literally all the time. She would also frequently be super late or return the next day to pick him up. I used to hate it when he came over because I thought he was a crybaby and he would sometimes steal my toys. He would always wet the bed too, which I hated because my grandmother would give him my bed when he stayed over and make me bunk with her and my mom. Obviously, as an adult, I realized that these issues stem from his constant neglect and abuse, but as a kid, I didn't understand that and only really thought about how he annoyed me. One night, he was staying over and him and I were playing on the floor with my Barbie dolls in the living room. I don't remember what time it was, but it was dark outside. And at some point, my mother had commented on how Debbie hadn't come back for her son yet, and it was several hours past pickup time. This was before cell phones, so besides calling her house phone a few times, there was no way of getting in touch with her. I remember my mom getting more and more aggravated because it was getting so late. Finally, Debbie comes back and she's with one of her new boyfriends. The guy's name was Steve and was locally known as Bad News. He was a tall, lean guy with an angry face and a very long criminal record, so of course she was smitten by him, I guess. They both stagger in, clearly drunk, and Debbie tells Tommy it's time to go, and he starts crying because he does not want to leave. Debbie tells him loudly to come on, but he doesn't move. And that's when Steve strides over to Tommy, who immediately turned and started to stand up. That's when Steve lifts his leg and kicks Tommy in the back hard with his boot. Tommy goes sprawling face first on the carpet and lets out this terrified, antagonizing scream that I still remember clearly to this day. Apparently, that wasn't enough for Steve, because he continued to kick him while Tommy was face down on the carpet, screaming. I remember looking at the other adults in the room, but they were just watching, not saying anything. Literally every other adult was just standing around, watching this man brutalize this tiny 5-year-old boy. At one point, Tommy wets himself and then vomits, which unleashes a fresh wave of enraged kicks from Steve, who tells him to get the f up, now. Finally, my grandmother tells him that they need to go so she can clean up. So Steve wordlessly picks up Tommy by the back of his shirt, who is just hanging limply now, crying, and storms out of the front door, with Debbie silently following behind. We moved away shortly thereafter, and I never learned what happened to him. Tommy never came back over, and I never saw him or his mother or Steve again. To this day, I'll never understand why my mother or my grandmother didn't call the police or CPS or anybody. When I asked them about it later, they just said they didn't want to get more involved than they already were, and that we were going to be leaving the neighborhood soon anyway. My theory today is that they were scared of Steve, possibly afraid of reaching out to the authorities because they were also abusive to me growing up. Maybe both. But almost 30 years later, it still haunts me. Even more so now that I'm an adult and I can truly understand how fucked up everything was about that night. It made me swear to myself that I would never, ever just stand around while a child is being abused. I have zero tolerance for it. I just hope that Tommy eventually made it out and is living a better life out there somewhere. No child ever deserves to be treated like that. I'm so sorry, Tommy. When I was 7, one of the younger girls in our class acted weird during lunch hour or any time there wasn't an adult supervising. She would take one of us boys to a corner and flash us or get us to put our hands down our pants. At the time I thought it was just strange, but I never thought to tell anyone about it because I thought I would get in trouble for seeing a girl naked. About 8 years later, I was getting training as a camp counselor for how to spot potential abuse victims, including those who've been sexually abused, and this girl popped into my head as I realized she ticked almost all the boxes. In addition to the above behavior, she was also very quick-tempered, was prone to violence, and had a few other tendencies that lined up. I'd switched schools about a year or two later after she joined the class, so to this day I have no idea what happened to her. Hopefully she wound up in a better place. I was a little kid back then, around 6 at most. I was living with a family friend back then because my mother worked all day and could not take care of me. One day, we were coming back from the grocery store. Our apartment complex has this entrance into the parking lot behind the building. The door is in that entrance, so while she was unlocking it, I was just playing around in the open space. That's when I heard a very loud crying from a little child. I looked over and I saw walking past the entrance a homeless-looking man, effortlessly pulling the crying boy by his arms. The kid was trying to pry himself away from the man, but couldn't do anything about it. It was very obvious that the kid did not belong to him due to how scared and distraught the child looked, plus the condition of the man and how serious he was. I didn't say anything. My nanny didn't see it, so she probably assumed it was nothing. We went home. I thought about what I saw and I didn't know what to make of it. Adults had told me before to stay away from strangers so I don't get abducted, and even then I knew that was likely what was happening to the boy. I was thinking about it for the rest of the day and I eventually forgot about it until I remembered it again some time ago. No matter how much I try to justify it to myself with being just a kid, or maybe that it was his son or grandson, I just can't look back at it and excuse myself. I hope whatever happened was then resolved and the boy was returned to his family if he really was kidnapped. Grew up in the ghetto for the first 15 years of my life and saw 2 dead bodies on average every year starting from about year 7. This all took place in the 90s. One that stuck out the most was having a neighbor that no one had seen for about 3 weeks. Turns out he was shot over drugs. Found out when we heard screaming, ran over to see what it was. Someone came to check on the place, and sitting on the couch was just a corpse covered in maggots. Rotting corpse is a smell you'll never forget. Only found out what really happened a while later. The person who shot him lived in one of the apartment buildings close by. This last incident was what caused the neighborhood to be closed and everyone kicked out. This poor dude, white guy in about his late 20s, early 30s, was believed to have gotten lost and turned into the wrong area, which obviously was on my street. Woke up in the morning to see a car had crashed into a light pole. Go to check it out, like the idiot I was. I'll never forget for as long as I live. The guy had been shot in the face several times. Someone tried to rob him and ended up killing him. What the police told my mom was that they had taken his wallet, which only had about 20 some odd bucks in it. The person who shot him wasn't much older than me. I remember the face and then talking to the police, and then it was the next day. I just completely blanked out because I couldn't fully register what happened. Police followed up with my mom a lot and highly recommended therapy. Sadly, we were extremely poor, so it wasn't an option. All other cases were just watching bodies being carried out of apartments. All murdered over dumb shit. I wouldn't say any of this haunts me anymore, but it's probably why I developed such a dark sense of humor and other things I would be harshly judged for. When you grow up in a situation like I did, it's not hard developing certain dislikes. My mom dead in a bathtub. I was around 11 at the time, I'm pretty sure. I lived only with my mom and my brother as my parents had split up and my dad moved countries. My mom had a heart attack a few years back while in the hospital with a broken ankle. Luckily, she survived it, but had a few heart problems afterwards. I stayed up late watching YouTube on my crusty iPad one night when I noticed it was 2 a.m. and my mom hadn't finished her bathtub yet. As soon as I stepped out of my room, I kinda just knew. I looked everywhere in the house. The living room, kitchen, bedroom, everywhere but the bathroom. Delaying the inevitable, I suppose. And when I did look in there, I found her almost completely underwater. Lifeless. I still remember the way her mouth was open and filled with water. The way I screamed so loud it felt as though as if I was watching myself from someone else's perspective. Shaking and screaming to my older brother and frantically running to the neighbors in my bare feet. The rest mostly is a blur, especially what happened while inside the bathroom on my phone with the ambulance. I grew up near a highway with a 70-mile-an-hour speed limit. One day our dog got out of our yard and ran onto the highway while I was helplessly trying to call it back. I'll never forget the sight of it getting hit, going under the bumper, and then bouncing between the pavement and the underside of the van. At least the driver had tried to stop. He got out and dragged the body off of the road and just looked up at me and said he's dead, with a kind of half shrug. Nothing more anyone could have said or done after that. My mom used to beat the shit out of me when I was a little kid, I lost count of the number of wooden spoons and broomsticks that were broken on my ass. When I was 13, I was working in the field with my mom, changing pipe from my uncle's field. I wasn't moving fast enough, so my mom decided to motivate me with a smack upside the head. This time was different. I blocked the hit, threw a smack back at her, and I knocked her on her ass. It stunned both of us. My mom stopped hitting me after that. But about 3 years later, my sister was ironing pillowcases, and she was doing it wrong. My mom starts getting more and more unhinged. She got the belt and was about to spank my sister with it. Something came over me and I snapped. Shoved my mom down, yanked the belt from her, and threatened her with it. Between sobs, I told my mom that I was all fucked up from the years of abuse. My sister was perfect, and she wasn't allowed to ruin my sister too. It wasn't as heroic as it sounds. It was noisy white trash, and I got into a lot of trouble over it. But my mom never beat my sister. Edit. Thanks for the kind words. In hindsight, this feels a little bit more like karma whoring. I'm fine and my sister's fine. I even get along with my mom. My mom wasn't evil. She just had a really bad temper. My parents have a story they each tell from time to time regarding their childhood. My mother was playing outside one day when she looked up and saw what she thought were fireworks. She thought they were pretty. But then she noticed other adults coming outside and crying or yelling. Turned out a plane had blown up just above her hometown. The kids were ordered inside, and apparently the adults were asked by authorities to go up on their roof and look for debris. My grandfather not only just found plane pieces, but body parts on his roof, which apparently my mother caught sight of as he was cleaning them up. My dad's story is much more straightforward. He walked into the garage one day to discover the family car running, despite all the garage doors and windows being shut. He turned the car off and then discovered that his father, my grandfather, was in the trunk, apparently intended on killing himself. My grandmother apparently came into the garage at that point and immediately ordered my dad out. However, they never talked about it afterwards and denied it ever happened, something which shook my dad pretty badly. For what it's worth, my grandfather did live a long life afterwards and seemed pretty happy for as long as I knew him, which, granted, was several decades after this event took place. My father met my mother when she was very young in a foreign country. Due to age difference, he was 40, she was 25. They would argue a lot. My mother, being young, she wanted to go out a lot and live her life. I walked up into the room once to find my father trying to suffocate my mother with a pillow. I was around 6 years old. When my father saw me, he completely stopped. He loved me so much despite the problems with my mother, and jumped in to hug me and took me into the other room. She called the police and put a restriction order on him. To this day, my mother says I saved her life, but that image has never left.